connect with, I guess, with reality really is that, you know, many of us in this room, as aside to being practitioners, not only are we parents, not only are we grandparents, aunts, uncles, we're members of the community. And I think aside to some of the challenges that we have within our society, I think it's become a real interesting time now where, in my opinion, it's getting quite scary because the things that we hear about, you know, even most recently, I've been looking at a particular case where, you know, young people as, you know, children as young as 11 involved in violent behaviors, and, you know, having a young teenager most definitely has, you know, and I think for many of us would agree, it makes a series of kind of worries and concerns when you know that your children are out and about, potentially in environments where young people may be involved in particular behaviors. And I think to set that scene really is to bring us into that context and understanding that we are in a very much a different time. Shez just mentioned that previously in our introduction. We are in a very different time. And I believe that part of today's session for me, to be totally honest, is about taking a position. If there's one thing that I want to come out of today's session with, is a very distinct position that I intend to take, one that I always talk about within my work, and I think is rooted in a theory that I talk about called desistance. And I think that's really important moving forward and really kind of looking at where are the gaps. And the two things that I want to just take out from this is not only about taking a position, but if we can, through this conversation today, start to look at where are the gaps. Where are the gaps within the literature? Where are the gaps in relation to professional practice? Where are the gaps as it relates to national and social policy? And wherever those gaps are, we have to make a decision on what we're going to do about it. Because what really bothers me about these conversations is that we have the same conversation over and over and over and over and over again. And it just doesn't seem to be feeling that things are moving. And I know that many of you in the room are overwhelmed. Many of you in the room feel that you've got massive caseloads and things don't seem to be changing. So if there's the third thing that I want, not only to enlighten you today, but hopefully to get us to start thinking how we can work smarter and not necessarily working harder. And just as a quick disclaimer, I just mentioned sometimes when I'm talking, having a little bit of a rant, I may mention some, I don't know, topics or maybe of some cases maybe that I've embarked on, some cases that many of you in the room have worked in conjunction with us in relation to those. And some of you may be currently working with some of those young people. I'll try my best not to make it Birmingham specific, but just as a disclaimer, I always kind of just like to give a little bit of context. Sometimes when I'm giving examples, I'll never name young people. So that's nothing that people need to essentially worry about. But it may be a situation or scenario where I may talk about something and it just brings people in light to that particular issue. So I don't tend to be the type of professional that shows images to kind of shock people. I don't believe in that form of education and shocking people, especially children and young people. But rather, if I do talk about a particular incident or an issue, it's also oftentimes I guess, an opportunity for us to have a better understanding about what's taking place within the society. And I think for those of us that are just probably a little bit outdated, for us to be up to the time with essentially what's going on. So that's just a quick disclaimer really for me, is really about how do we move that conversation into action. And I think someone just mentioned that within that. And I think the best place to start really is my research. And I think a lot of people have been kind of fascinated. I always get questions and people say, you know, Craig, what are you actually doing within your PhD? And I think just to kind of take you back a little bit, one of the things that I've been doing, I guess, over the last 2 decades is I've always studied gangs, and I guess street gangs to be specific, in and around the Birmingham area. And I've always been quite fascinated with the way in which the media have a very interesting role in depicting and also creating what I would call individuals in the community that we as a society should be scared of, and the kind of academic term moral panic. But I don't want to have an academic conversation today, but I want to kind of talk in layman's terms. But one of the things I talk about within my research is, I guess, the politics of race and crime. And I know that if you was to go to Google right now and you was to type street gangs in Birmingham, and any documentary that was to pop up on YouTube, or if anything was to pop up on your social media feeds, these are the types of images generally that you're going to come up, that's going to come up essentially on Google. And I guess my fascination with this type of research was oftentimes we don't ever focus on any of the other gangs that talk about violence, that engage in violence, that also utilize firearms and knives and explosives to engage in criminal behavior. And it's just quite interesting that when we talk about violence as it relates to gangs, that we only fixate only on one particular group. And of course, yes, you're going to have those discussions about organized criminality. Of course, you're going to have those conversations about what groups seem to be more sophisticated within their crimes. But regardless of all of those arguments that essentially may be presented, one of the things that we just don't see within the news feeds and oftentimes in the media, unless you're an individual that pays a little bit more cause of concern for the issues around these particular issues, that would pay attention to these particular groups and gangs that exist within our community. And I think this highlights a wider conversation. And one of the things that I don't want to do is kind of bore you with the same conversations, as you heard me say in the beginning, over and over again, talking about the same thing. And I guess what I want to do is just go straight into it in terms of what the literature says, what's missing from the literature, and also the points that I believe that we kind of overlook. So if we look at this through a, let's say, a historical lens, we can go back as far as, you know, the riots. And I would say before even 2011, when the riots took place, there was conversations between that 2008 and 2011 conversation about austerity. This was when we went from a Labour government going into a Conservative government, from Tony Blair to David Cameron. You may remember David Cameron was talking about the big society, the broken society, and all of these things that were going around at that particular time. And that was probably the biggest moment for youth work practitioners nationally, because that's when we started to then experience some severe cuts. And those cuts not only impacted youth and community services, but they also impacted social care, it impacted children's services, and then the ripple effect of what was happening, I guess, in the initial stages. 2011 gave us a reminder nationally of when you cut back, when you make cuts, when austerity and people are living under acute poverty, these are the things that are ultimately going to happen. And I guess after research on the back of all of those particular issues, these are the things that are oftentimes highlighted within the research. Poverty, deprivation, gentrification, I would probably say is more so new, but I would say gentrification has always been a conversation about moving poor people out of particular areas and environments, and then ensuring that individuals that have wealth, finance, can move into a particular area or space. And we see these things happening in different cities, in London, in places like South London, Brixton, and we're starting to see parts of that now in Birmingham. If we think of the Ladywood area going into Birmingham city centre, we're now starting to see what gentrification does as a consequence of that. But we already know within the research that, you know, if we was to go around the room right now, if we had time, I think everybody would probably highlight one of these things about the impact of poor education, the impact of high unemployment, and the fact that people are struggling with work, lack of resources within community. There's not enough funding to deal with the issues that we're worried and we're concerned about: poor housing conditions, racism, trauma, fear, reactive interventions by professionals and organizations, competency of staff. Are they even aware of these issues? Adultification of young people, limited resources within the police, and the list goes on. But if you've noticed, I've highlighted a few things that I argue that we overlook, not only within the research, but also within professional practice. And especially when we're talking about how do we respond in 2022 and beyond, how do we respond to the issues that are adversely impacting the lives of children and young people? And one of the things that we oftentimes don't talk about is the impact of racism. When we're talking about systemic, structural racism, institutionalized racism, and how does that create an impact for different communities, and especially when we're talking about children and young people that come from particular backgrounds. And without boring you with all of the statistics, we know that there is an overrepresentation underrepresentation as it relates to exclusions, an overrepresentation as it relates to stop and search, an overrepresentation when we're talking about children that end up in things like alternative provisions, when we're talking about children and young people that need potentially a safe move from a particular environment that may cause or be a cause of concern due to some level of violence or antisocial behavior. So we don't have to go through the data because there are so many reports and there are so many pieces of literature that people have took the time to do research and conduct to give us an understanding of what's essentially taking place. We know racism is a perfect and an issue, and it's live. One of the things that we oftentimes overlook, and many of my trauma colleagues or specialist colleagues in the building would also agree, is the impact of children's mental health and their well-being. And the impact of trauma, especially when we're talking about children and young people that live within gang-impacted environments, children and young people that have been in environments where violence is a norm, where environments, children and young people have observed violence. But I also want to talk about a point that I've highlighted, but I'll talk about it in much depth a little bit later, around the impact of social media and vicarious trauma, where young people are documenting their experiences, they're documenting their violent activities, and the impact of that then creates fear within particular communities. And one of the things I always talk about within my research is that we oftentimes don't address the fear, which links then to reactive interventions. So we create a series of interventions within our organizations to engage children and young people, regardless of their age, their background, their gender, their belief, whatever it is that may be different, or they classify it as their difference. We create reactive interventions, meaning that we wait for something to happen, then we respond. And I think one of the biggest problems that we're currently dealing and facing with right now is how children are being seen as adults and responded to as such. And how many incidents are we currently seeing throughout our society, within our small communities, where young people are treated a particular type of way because of their aesthetics. And I know that most definitely was something that I always kind of experienced. I was always tall and big at one point, and every kind of interaction that I embarked on, I was always seen by adults as somebody that was way more older than I was, but essentially I just was a young child that was trying to navigate my way through life. And when young people get given these particular labels within society, and especially when they're put older than they actually are, sometimes it's very difficult when we're trying to empathize and sympathize with children and young people that are genuinely going through problems, and also throughout our organizations, how they sometimes get overlooked. And the last important part of the literature that I argue that's oftentimes overlooked is the role of social media. And this is where my expertise and my research essentially sits, with understanding the role of technology and the role of media in its way in which young people understand, and also the wider society and how they understand and respond to these particular issues. And I think it makes perfect sense that despite that we talk about that historical lens of where we're at in terms of the why, because all this does is explain the why. Why do we see more young people engaging in violence? Why do we see more young people engaging in gangs? Why do we see more young people joining groups that are involved in the far right? Why do we see more young people joining terrorist organizations that may be involved in religious extremism and ending up in places like Turkey and then going on to places like Syria? Why are we seeing more and more young people engaging in different behaviors? It's important that we understand not only through that historical lens, because we understand where we are today. And I think we have to also talk about what's happened in the last 2 years and how COVID-19 has exacerbated all of these issues. So if we were worried over the last decade and the debate that we were having as a consequence of racism and trauma and fear and austerity and gentrification and poverty and then reactive interventions and social media and damaged relationships between the police and so on and so forth, all social media has done, added with COVID-19, has exacerbated these issues. And that's partly why many of us in the room would probably agree that the impact of COVID, what we've seen within the wider society, and especially as a personal reflection, is it's almost kind of created the highlight moment around social inequality. The haves and the have-nots. That's what COVID-19 has essentially showed me. Those that have, those that can, and those that have the opportunity or the privilege to be able to do things versus a wider society that struggle, or wider society that can't. And just think about the debates that have been taking place as it relates to something as simple as the vaccination programs and the communities that rejected or potentially were cynical or were particularly optimistic about potentially taking a jab, and look at the backlash, what was going to happen, and look at the threats within the NHS and social care and the impact that would have created for specific communities and not necessarily the majority. But when we home in on children and young people, and there's been some research that's been conducted, it's not been extensive, by the way, but I know the National Youth Agency, I know that I was supporting a number of publications that came out. Some of you may have read those, but this is just a highlight. But there's two ways that I want us to look at this. Number one, to just kind of be aware of these are the kind of tenets of the vulnerabilities of our children and young people. But the second thing for me is about the gaps, because one of the things I don't want to do today is just talk about the problem, but I'm very much about talking about solutions, turning that talk into action. So this is going to probably be your most contemporary data that you're going to get. And the vulnerabilities of our children and young people have been heightened in the pandemic, coming out of that historical context that I've just mentioned and where we are right now. So the increased mental health problems of our children and young people, just look around of what's going on. Have you not noticed that young people seem to be more agitated, anxious? More young people are nervous because the things that are going on in their society, those children and young people that have been inside for such a long period of time and haven't really had much human interaction. We can talk about adults for a moment, and I even know many family members and friends that have struggled in the pandemic. What about children and young people? So whilst their mental health and well-being has been impacted, we also have to think about the young people that have been missing from education for long periods of time. Those young people that were out of school, those young people that maybe were excluded. What about also those young people that were going through those transitions? Those young people that were moving from year 6 to 7? What about those young people that moved from year 11 to either sixth form or to college? And in those particular timeframes when the pandemic was at its height, that those individuals oftentimes were not being engaged. So what about those young people, and then go back to the point about their mental health and go back to their issue around their well-being? But then you also had the issue around domestic violence and abuse and harm that existed in people's households. So then you had a lot of young people that, if you remember, especially in the context of West Midlands, in parts of Liverpool, in parts of Manchester, in parts of London, that there was loads of young people that were out and about in the wider community. Those young people were out and about in the wider community, and what was the ignorance of some things that were floating about in the media and also conversation that were taking place online. And the argument was young people were out and about, not following government guidelines, they're unruly, they don't want to engage, and so on and so forth. And to an extent, there may have been some categories of young people, possibly, but there was a vast groups of young people that were dealing with issues around violence, dealing with issues around all forms of abuse. And as a consequence of that, were being out and about. But what was happening in relation to their vulnerability? You may remember there was a number of incidents that took place, let's say West Midlands in particular, where there were young people eating pizza outside a chicken shop, and those young people were being shot at and caught up in gang rivalry. Not because that they were being disobedient, because a lot of those children and young people were navigating their way in their community, not trying to be outside or inside, their households. But then also those young people that were not in education, especially for those that were not in mainstream education, who was engaging with those particular children and young people. And then to add parts to the wound, there was young people that didn't have access to the internet. So there was loads of discussions nationally about acute poverty, to the point where we even seen footballers and celebrities having to create charities and donate because we were in almost like a crisis. Because again, what COVID-19 did was show us that social inequality is greater than it has ever been before. So then do we blame the young people for the risky behaviors? You may remember the famous video that we all seen coming out of the pandemic, right in the middle of Hyde Park, young people chasing each other with long bladed weapons, Rambo knives. And we observe these particular things and we just think, oh, these young people are crazy. And we say these things, but let's put it in context of what's happened over the last 2 years, then added on to the 10 years of the conversation that we just had previously. But then what about the issue of homelessness? What about the issue of young people as it relates to self-harm and suicide? And I know that we've been observing more and more children and young people seem to be self-harming and committing suicide. And whether or not these issues have made it to the news headlines, we know that these issues exist within our community. Why? Because we talk about it. Why? Because we observe it. Why? Because we're having to be on the ground and deal with it. So when we go back to our previous conversation about lack of resources and being able to respond to these particular issues, then we understand why we have so much problems that we're faced with right now. And our most recent reality is now this. And this is my frustration. And I think my frustration is more so about CPD, my frustration about all of the inset days that we do with our fellow practitioners, whether that be in school, whether that will be in alternative provisions, whether that may be in social care, even with the NHS, with youth offended, with the police, and so on and so forth. Yet still we're not getting it right. And I'm not sure about you, but it's quite frustrating, and it also angers me, not only as a parent, but also as a member of the community, but also an individual that invests a lot of time in shaping the mindset, the narratives of what takes place within these particular spaces. But I think it's important that we acknowledge and we understand these particular issues. And where these things become really important is understanding what's the gaps. Because the bigger question for me here is not only how are we starting to address issues of systemic racism that exists within, I would argue, all institutions here within Great Britain. But I think secondly, how are we implementing the learning as it relates to things like safeguarding, contextual safeguarding of our children and young people? Or are we just putting young people into categories and we're just kind of reading all of the reports and all of the policies that are there, we're putting them on the shelf, but in practice, we don't seem to be doing anything. Because that's what the atmosphere and the temperature feels like. And I know many of you in the room essentially would share that. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that. And sorry, I've just noticed that there's a question in the group, what about young people living in parental, with essentially mental illness? And just to take you back, that in this current research, it is highlighted, that topic is highlighted in the issue around young people being at risk at home, and talking about the adverse childhood experiences for many of those children and young people. So you're right in terms of that question, and it is highlighted, but the key things that comes up in the research over the last 2 years.
The course is the Working with Gangs and Serious Youth Violence Level 3 course. It's an accredited programme, which is accredited through AIM, formerly known as OCN West Midlands. We have 8 different modules to the programme, which basically is designed to give you a holistic understanding of working with young people impacted by serious youth violence and gangs.
These programs are important because what we're trying to recognise in the country is that there needs to be a standard, and a standard around recognising how do we respond to serious youth violence, how do we respond to all forms of criminal exploitation as it affects our children and young people and our wider families within the community.
I think the Gangs and Serious Youth Violence course was probably one of the best things I've done in the last decade, for sure.
been a great experience so far. I've met so many people from so many different backgrounds and professions, working really widely across the youth sector, and it's been really helpful to listen to other people's points of views and experiences.
It was the first course, it was a certificate that I'd had for a long time, something that I wanted. I now write programmes, so I've written a couple of programmes on gang awareness and prevention, knife awareness, self-awareness, bullying. So before I did the gangs course, if you would have asked me to do something like that, I would have told you, I ain't got a clue what you want about, how am I gonna do that? So for me, the course was amazing because it's just opened up lots of things that I didn't know that I could do, that I'm now doing.
Being an adult learner, number one, and someone who hasn't been in, necessarily formal education for a long time, coming into a course that had so many options to support you through your learning, it was quite clear when I started the course that the objective of the educators wasn't for me to just get through the course, but it was to make sure that the students understood and had a full understanding and a holistic understanding of the information.
I've been looking at courses to do with youth and gang violence for quite a long time now, and this one really stood out, A, because it's one of its kind, there's not many about, and secondly, the professionals that lead this particular course are outstanding in their field.
We work with a range of practitioners, people who are specialists within their fields, who have years of experience in working with young people that have their own specialisms as well.
Bringing people in with lived experience is a really important aspect, and that's something that's happened. I grew up in an environment where I've lived around serious youth violence and can say I've been a victim to that. Also having people from communities that are working every day in serious youth violence come in and deliver to the people on the course or the cohort. So I think it's unique in that sense because actually you're learning directly from people with experience.
The importance of having people like myself on this programme as recognised as one of the leading experts in the country around responding to serious youth violence, I think it kind of gives that USP to the course, that it means that the organisers that have developed this particular programme have really thought about who do we bring in to give those real insights.
I've always done little one-day courses and stuff like that, but yeah, they're nothing like this. This is the course that gave me more knowledge and more understanding of working with young people, especially serious youth violence.
I have not experienced a course like this before. I've been to uni, I've studied criminology, had probably two good lecturers, but this course was just different. It was like, I actually looked forward to like what the topics were, how I can apply it and stuff like that, and it was like a little family. It ended up being like a little family, everyone helping out each other.
This is the only qualification in the UK. In fact, we've been hard pushed to find this qualification anywhere in the world, and we know because we looked. There's no other qualification like it. It's a course that is very much rooted in the community. It's very much grounded around having that holistic understanding of actually how do you work with young people who are impacted by gangs and serious youth violence.
That's why this course will have people from the police force, from social workers, from people who are working as teachers, people working in PRUs, people who are in the youth offending service. Everyone comes to this course because there are no other courses like this.
I think a lot of professionals make an assumption as to what serious youth violence is, and I think a lot of professionals band children into the term gang, when actually there is a significant difference between children that are engaging in serious youth violence, gang members and organised crime groups.
We have two courses which cater for, I suppose, different types of circumstances. So we have our distance learning course, which enables you to study alone basically, go at this particular programme. You get access to our portal, you get pre-recorded content, and you can just basically study this programme by yourself. And that programme is open all year round. The blended learning course currently runs once a year. So we usually start the course in and around April time, and it lasts until November, December. But the blended learning gives us the option to, work with other people and also get those lectures live. So that's whether that's live online or as well face-to-face. So it's that blended learning experience that we offer through our certificate programme.
And I think that brings us to a particular point. So if we think about that historical context and we think about what's happened over the last 2 years as it relates to the pandemic, I think we can come to a particular point now and agree that the issues are increasingly becoming complex and more nuanced. It's not straightforward anymore. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was very clear about what was happening in our community. We were able to pinpoint and see what the problems were. And that's why I want to move us beyond just the typical conversations of why do young people join gangs? Why do young girls join gangs? What are the impacts of young people that join gangs? What is the impact of communities? We had those conversations and been having those conversations for 2 decades. You ain't going to get that information and conversation from me today. But it is about understanding about the changing nature of violence, the changing nature of youth cultures that oftentimes are violent, that causes an adverse impact on young people that may not come from those particular backgrounds. Because what we have now is more and more young people, especially over the last 2 years, that haven't been known to services, that haven't been brought up by any social work team or any team that's linked to any form of antisocial behavior or any form of history of violence within the community. We're now starting to see more and more young people that don't come from those particular backgrounds and environments, and it's those young people now that are the cause of concern. Because they're becoming more and more complex. So I'll go back to my original point about taking a position. That we have to take a position here. We have to no longer just keep having the same conversation about we only want to just work with young people that are in gangs. We only just want to work with young people that are involved in counter lines. Because one of the things that you probably have observed is that all of these issues are now starting to overlap with each other. So this is the biggest question. Are we fit for purpose? These are the conversations, and I believe that this should be the foundation for all organizations and individuals that want to enter into this space. Are we, as collectives, fit for purpose? And one of the things that I always talk about, some of you are familiar with this when I express this, is that every organization should do a skill audit. Every organization should do a skill audit. With every practitioner, every system, every process, we have to ask the question, are we fit for purpose? Because if we're not fit for purpose, then what we're going to have is more and more of the issues that we see amongst our children and young people, times 10. We're going to see more of it. So if your organization only works with young people from the model of raising awareness, you're going to lose young people. We have to be honest with these conversations now. If you're only raising awareness and not showing young people how they can alleviate the issues that they're confronted with, if we are not giving young people strategies of how they can remove themselves from these issues, and we're only raising awareness, we are going to lose another generation of children and young people. If our organizations think that just by throwing money in the community is going to solve the problem, we're also going to find ourselves in a situation, in a scenario where the money is going to be taken. It's going to be taken, it's going to be received with the thank you, but is it going to create any impact? Or is it just putting plasters on the wound? For those out there that are doing research, if you are not making yourself a part of the communities and you're not investing in those communities that you seek to understand, then all you're going to be utilizing is a series of narratives based on false claims. So when we start to talk about specific approaches in a moment, I think it's very much an important conversation that Monday morning we need to start having with our organizations and start thinking about what we need to be doing to become fit for purpose. And one of the things that I talk about within my work is that despite the fact that I'm always asked to talk about gangs and serious youth violence, is that I always say as part of my position is that we need to move beyond what I call the gang narrative. Because we can focus on the politics and gangs and gang violence, and I'll be totally honest. Most of the fatalities that exist within my local community. Most of the young people that have become victims to some element of serious youth violence were not gang members. I'll say that one more time. Young people that I've observed, or young people that I've had to bury as a consequence of serious youth violence, those young people weren't gang members. So then that means then we have to take a position and not just looking at youth violence through one silo. I'm not arguing here and suggesting that gang violence is not a problem. But I know that for the vast majority of our children and young people in our community that are either perpetrators or victims of violence, these are young people that are not necessarily involved in gangs, but may come from an environment where gangs may be prevalent in that particular community. And I'll break that down a little bit later. But I think it's important that we understand and we highlight that. Why, to conclude the point, is that when we only focus on one category of young people that are involved in violence, then what we do as a consequence is we miss a vast group of young people. Case in point, I meet more young people that carry knives, more young people that have access to firearms than young people that I work with that are in gangs that have knives and firearms. I'll say that one more time. I work with a whole lot more young people that have knives and have access to firearms compared to young people that I know that are in gangs that have knives and firearms. So if the focus is only on gangs, then what about those young people in our community that are scared? What about those young people in our community that haven't had access to the issues within our community that just oftentimes gets missed by practitioners, parents, religious leaders? What about those young people? So I think it's important that we start to talk about how do we start to move beyond. And then we ask ourselves even more of a critical question. Are we even clear about what we're talking about? Are we even clear about what we want to stop? Because another position that I take is that I don't think that we're clear about what we want to stop. Do we want violence to stop? Do we want hate crime to stop? Do we want young people stop being involved in counterlines? Do we want some young people to stop ending up on planes and ending up in Syria? What is it that we want to stop in our community? Because I think there's a blurred line when I ask oftentimes organizations to give me a clear breakdown of what it is that you want to stop. And some of us may say, well, it's a little bit of everything. But I ask even more of a critical question. A little bit of everything is not actually very clear about what it is that you want to ultimately engage. And then a deeper question and conversation would be is, based on your strategy and your approach as your organization, what does it look like to alleviate those particular issues? Because if you're just thinking about just going into schools and just raising awareness about knife crime and gun crime and criminal exploitation, even though it has an interesting and amazing aspect of children and young people's education as it relates to their awareness, it's not going to ultimately solve their problem. So is there clarity in the community about what we want to stop? And that's partly why when you probably attend a lot of community events, probably when you've gone to a lot of things that are taking place within the community where people want some sort of approach to take place, that it always seems very passionate in the moment, but it doesn't amount to anything a little bit later. And that's not no dig or disrespect, but it's talking about an approach and a strategy, because any organization, nationally or internationally, that have embarked on a particular approach, it's never been based on emotion. It's always been based on clear guidelines, clear research that's indicated both the gaps, both the knowledge gaps, but also what needs to be done differently. And then we stand on the shoulders of individuals and organizations that have already done the work. So in a city like Birmingham, we know, and some of those individuals in the room right now have been doing this work for decades. So our role is about identifying who those individuals are, what their organizations actually do, and we stand on their shoulders. We don't disrespect, we don't push them to the side, we stand on their shoulders. And that's part of the problem in most cities nationally, is that individuals think that they have the one idea, they have the one initiative, they have the one approach and how to respond to these particular issues. And all it just ends up being is that your organization in isolation working on your own, not attached to the community, thinking that you're doing the best job. And that also becomes part of the problem. And a lot of the issues that we talk about as it relates to being reactive, I think becomes really important to the conversation. And I think the biggest thing about being reactive partly is because we don't spend, and I say we collectively, not thus in the room, is that we don't spend enough time understanding the world through the lens of children and young people. Because we sit behind our titles, we sit behind all of the terms that we utilize to introduce ourselves. If I ask you the most specific question, like name me 2 drill rappers that have gone to #1 in the pop charts, then everybody starts to get wide-eyed. Name me 2 grime artists other than Stormzy. Name me 2 tracks that Digga D has made over the last 6 months, and people are like, Craig, I don't know what you're talking about. But yet people are going to sit in front of us as collectives and say that they're the head of this, the head of that, and they work specifically in the community with young people that are on the cusp of these serious issues that we're worried and we're concerned about. That's not me saying that. This is what the young people are saying. They're saying that we don't understand them, because what happens is we sit in rooms just like this, talking to each other through our research, through our practice, through our experiences, which is great. But how are we using the narratives and the voices of children and young people through the context of the things that we're talking about every single day? That's the biggest question. Because when you speak to children and young people in 2022, they'll say things like, we hate the system. When you speak to children and young people in 2022, they'll say things like, their workers don't understand them. They're using language that we don't even understand. Some workers are still not even working with young people. They're sitting from what I call the ivory tower, thinking that with all of this knowledge and expertise and all of these amazing, pretty buildings that they have, that young people are supposed to come to them. When the principle of youth work has always been voluntary. The principle of youth work has always been that it's a luxury and a privilege for us as workers, for young people to want to come into our spaces. And many of us are not even engaging with young people. Some of us are 5 years out of date. Some of us are 10 years out of date. Some of us are 20 years out of date. This is not me saying this, this is young people. Young people are saying that they feel trapped. Young people are saying that, you know what? Education's long. So if education's long, I'm online and I've noticed that I can flip some money through doing things through social media, being an influencer as opposed to going to school. Some of us don't even know that's even going on. Some of us are talking to young people about being off-road and not being involved in criminal activity, but they're saying that they can make so much more money through stocks and shares, through NFTs, through cryptocurrency. And I know if I was to go around the room right now and I was to say to some random, can someone tell me about cryptocurrency and NFTs? There's going to be quite a few people in the room that don't have a clue what I'm talking about. But we're telling young people that they shouldn't be involved in county lines and selling drugs. And all I'm just pointing out here is the obvious, that we are so out of date with children and young people in the current context. So the biggest question is, if we are out of date, what are we doing as individuals to get that CPD to be up to the time? What are we doing within our organizations so we can become up to the time? And what are we doing different within our organization that doesn't do the traditional method of learning things amongst adults? What are we actively doing amongst children and young people to develop and learn? Because this is what we see. And this is just a visual representation of the stuff that Solve and ACT and other organizations that are in the room right now talk about. That based on some of the challenges and the issues that we're focused on right now, in that 10-year time frame that I've just mentioned, but now I want to include an extra 3 years of the impact of COVID-19, is that a lot of our children and young people are probably feeling a little bit isolated and lonely. Why? Because there are systemic issues at play. So I don't want to just talk about what happens on the ground and in the community. We can be here all day and talk about that because we know and we're very aware of what's taking place in the local community. But those systemic issues also contribute to the fact of why children and young people feel even more and more marginalized in its present context. But we're disorganized as a community, going back to one of the points that I just mentioned, because some of us are doing amazing work. Some of us in the room are doing amazing work. But there's a number of things happening here. Number one, people are hiding and trying to do amazing work in silos because maybe they're worried about someone stepping on their toes. Maybe they're worried about somebody entering into their lane. Maybe they're worried about the fact that they believe that they are the only individual in that lane and should be in that lane. But you've also got other individuals that just don't communicate at all. There are individuals that don't communicate with the amazing work that's taking place. So then what happens then is, typical example, a week and a half ago, you have parents that will say things like, there's nothing taking place in Birmingham for young people. And I know the organizations that are in the room are doing amazing things for young people in the Easter break, coming into the summer break that's going to be shortly. So how is it that the parent doesn't know that's taking place in the community? How is it that the local teachers, the local nursery practitioners don't know what's going on in the local community? So there is a disconnection, which we have to admit. There's a disconnection somewhere. Either those organizations are either not promoting themselves in the right place, or they're not thinking of different creative ways to promote their services in the local community to the different parents and different organizations, or there's an ignorance that exists within the community that claims that nothing's going on, but in reality, parents and members of the community and professionals including haven't took the time to do any research. And how many times do I meet professionals that say, oh, there's nothing taking place for young people? But I ask, when's the last time you went to the local youth center? When's the last time you connected with the local third sector organizations in the community? When's the last time you connected with the detached youth organizations in your local community? And they're like, never. So now you understand my point. So a young person in an environment that's feeling lonely, isolated, marginalized, alienated, in an environment where we claim to be all of these things, not working with each other in unity, you can understand then why young people want the need to join these particular groups. But I want you to think about this in context of what I've already said, the last 2 years. So young people, the vulnerabilities that was highlighted in the research by the National Youth Agency. So the highlighted things that was mentioned as the 7 key things. You can understand why young people want to join groups, because you remember me talking about fear, which I said was overlooked. So if young people are scared, if young people are trying to navigate their way through their environment, you can understand why they want to join these particular groupings. Problem is, however, is that when they join these particular groupings that are involved in issues within the community, there is a high probability that these children and young people are going to participate in any form of criminal activity. And then how do we respond? Arrested, residential care, child secure, YOY, or mental health services pick them up. But guess what? At some point in time, they're going to return back to the community, probably feeling a little bit more isolated and lonely. Not only are they more isolated and lonely, they also got new labels that we as society give them: ex-offender, criminal, thief, robber. And then we don't change. So then that explains then why they go right back to what they know. So going back to my point earlier, as I said in the beginning about radical approaches, this is what Norfolk did. So looking at this particular research, what Norfolk essentially did was calculated essentially how much it would pay for a child or young person to essentially go through these processes, and kind of estimated it was in the region between the 60 to 68,000 mark. And all the question was asked was, if £68,000 was used differently, how could we use it? And all those particular approaches then changed. So the radical approach was moving from a punitive model, even though it's about social care and help, it's very much a punitive model. And I would say most of our organizations, and especially when talking about statutory services, is sitting within a punitive measure or model. So we wait for something to take place, then we do something about it, and we're then very limited in what we actually can do because we only got a little bit of resource for the things that we really want to do with young people. And when that doesn't work, we put them right back in. Typical scenario, young person's causing a cause of concern. Oh, we're just going to get him a mentor. Yeah, get the young person a mentor, get some mentoring on for 6 to 8 weeks. And then when that 6 to 8 weeks mentoring doesn't seem like it's working, then we do the punitive model. And that's my point. It's a flawed model that we're using. It's not being proactive, it's reactive, because we're waiting for children and young people to essentially do something wrong or be a cause of concern in order for us to be able to roll out our particular practice. And this is what becomes problematic, because what social media is now doing is exacerbating all of the issues. And that's why I call in my research social media murder media, because what it's doing by default is actually destroying our children and young people. Of course, there are so many positive and creative things that take place in the online space. That's not what I'm talking about here right now. But what I am talking about is how social media now is being used to not only exploit, to coerce, to manipulate children and young people, whether that is violence, whether that is joining groups such as gangs or groups that are involved in selling drugs or going out of town to sell drugs involved in county lines, groups that are involved in forms of extremism, whether that is religious or ideological based on race, whatever that may be. This is what social media is essentially now doing. So I'll go right back to what I said in terms of an approach. As your organizations, we have to ask the question, are we fit for purpose? Because if your organization is not using and engaging children and young people via technology and social media, just like with language, just like with understanding young people in its contemporary time, we've already lost the race. This is not me saying that. This is what young people are also saying. So how are we using the narratives as workers to understand these particular issues? This becomes really important, because one of the challenges, or I would say the top 5 challenges that issues around social media essentially present itself, I guess, is this. Do we even know what's going on? Again, a repeated question again. I think number 2, is it ethical that we should spy on our young people? If that's where young people are at, if young people are now increasingly using social media platforms, Instagram, Snapchat, WhatsApp, Twitter, maybe YouTube, to interact with each other, is it ethical to spy on our young people? And then another question is, based on the intelligence that's given to us through the things that we watch, individuals or as our organizations, what do we do with that information? Because by default, could we be criminalizing children and young people? Because it puts us in a very difficult situation. Why? Because on one end, we argue at the injustice of things like the gang matrix in London. For those that don't know, so we're talking about a database where young people believed to be involved in criminality, to be involved in street gangs and violence as it relates to street gangs. Young people end up on the database. And what was argued from this database by a number of human rights activists and organizations was that this database is highly prejudiced, that what we're predominantly seeing on this particular database is predominantly Black and Asian males, and it doesn't really talk about any other form of criminality other than the groups that we see within places like inner city London. But that's the flip side of it, because when we talk to individuals about these particular issues, could children and young people end up on databases based on the intelligence that we're ultimately gathering? And then the last question is, are we even equipped to deal with these issues? So if we already don't know where young people are at in terms of their popular youth cultures, if we don't understand where they're at in terms of what's going on in contemporary times in their local communities, if we don't know what's going on in terms of the mindset of our children and young people as it relates to their mental health and their well-being, and then we're still stuck in terms of the policies and procedures that I argue is out of date, now we're talking about social media. And are we even equipped? So it goes back to the bigger question, are we fit for purpose? And I think as collectives, nationally, I don't think that we are. Individuals, organizations scattered around the country, you're doing a brilliant job. And I'm not arguing, but I'm talking about the mass majority. Because ideally, it's the mass majority that's actually going to change the face in being able to look at this stuff from a systemic issue and not just a local issue. And I think these things become really important, Because now when we start to really dig deep now, when we're talking about the shift of technology, and we're talking about the shift in terms of what's going on as it relates to our children and young people, these are the things that we consistently overlook. Because we just think that the issues of children and young people engaging in violent behaviors is solely on the basis of just because they want to do it, or they're in a situation or a circumstance that create the environment for them to behave that way. And yes, there are going to be some truths within those particular points. But why don't we start to look at these things through a different lens? So we talk about mental health and well-being, and many of my colleagues in the building in that field will agree when I start talking about things like addictions, and maybe asking new questions as opposed to asking why do young people become violent. What about are our children and young people becoming more and more addicted to technology that then causes violent behaviors and mindsets? And I would think that many of us would agree. So then the question then is, going back to your approaches, if then we are agreeing that social media can become addictive, just like when young people were playing Fortnite a couple of years ago, remember? And young people were becoming addicted to Fortnite and other particular games. Can they become addicted then to Snapchat, to Instagram, to YouTube, to Twitter? And if they then can become addicted, then the most logical question as a practitioner would be, what initiative are you rolling out and program are you rolling out to engage with addictions? Or is it still about, oh, you shouldn't join gangs, or you shouldn't be involved in county lines, or, you know, we should talk about healthy relationships? And I'm not shunning those things, and I'm not saying that they're not important, but I'm going to go back to the original question again. Are they, and are these approaches fit for purpose? And these things become really important when understanding what these particular things are. Because my second argument to young people becoming more addicted to social media platforms is that these media platforms are increasingly turning and making our children and young people more and more narcissistic. I'm not arguing and suggesting our young people are narcissists, but it's creating narcissistic tendencies. Why? Because what is all of these platforms essentially, what are their platforms essentially doing? To showcase what you're doing, and 24/7. So when you look at Snapchat 24/7, what it's all about, showcasing what you're doing. Is it wrong? Question mark. Because as I said earlier on, is that I'm not suggesting that social media platforms are not and cannot be used for positive means, because some organizations in the room right now utilize social media for amazing things and ensuring that positivity are constantly out there whilst there's so much negativity taking place. But when you look at social media platforms, just look at some of your friends and your family. Just look at their social media platform. Go to Instagram after you finish this and you're going to giggle. What is it saying? Look at me, look at me, look at me. I'm a vegan. I'm a PT. Look at me. I've got the biggest, I've got the nicest handbags. I've got the best car. And just look at me, just look at me, just look at me. So whilst this is taking place, and if young people are then communicating every single day on these particular platforms, and then we see the use of the like button, we can see when young people then start to develop mindsets around how can I create and how can I attain more and more likes. And then the second question is, what happens then if somebody dislikes what I'm projecting on a social media platform? What about if someone comments on a social media platforms that I then don't like? Because when you look at social media platforms, all we're seeing is the same negative narratives. That's actually blurred, but it's the same narratives. That if you want to make money, going back to the reality of our children and young people, which we began with, young people want to make money, and what social media is doing through the lens of some young people that are involved in criminal activity are saying the only way you can make money is through trapping. Sell some drugs, go OT, go hit one of the bandos. It's all easy. Easy, fastest way you can make money. Trap. And then you have music, and then you have celebrities, and then you have films that reference people like Pablo Escobar and your Al Chapos, and they make it out like these individuals, it was just so easy to make thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds. And then the question is, are young people really making this amount of money in these crack houses and these bandos? And this is the harsh reality for a lot of our young people, is that they're not. Is that they're not. And I'll break it down to make it make sense, just in case people are saying, no, Craig, you're not quite accurate in that one. So yes, a particular crack house may make 20 to 50,000 pounds, but that 20 or 50,000 pounds doesn't go to the runner or the individual that's working in the crack house. That goes to the individual that put them there. That's the point I was making. So my argument that I always present to a lot of predominantly social workers and youth workers that work with young people that say they want to make money, or young people that have been found in a crack house, in a bando, have been found out of town by the police and have been brought in, and we start working with them. And then those young people say they want to make money. And then they say, I make all of this particular money. Most youth workers or youth work practitioners go from a default position, and they say the same thing all the time. And some of you may have come to terms with this one. Some of you may have heard it, and some of you probably are guilty of doing it over and over again. And the position is this: well, how can I create an intervention or a program to work with this young person, and he's making hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds a week? Well, the reality is there is no intervention that's going to counteract a young person that's making hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds a week. But the vast reality is that's a default position, because number one, you've made the assumption that that young person generally makes all of that money. And in most cases, as I said, young people don't make that money. That amount of money goes through their hands, they see it, but they don't take it home. And this is the stuff that doesn't get promoted on social media platforms by the individuals that entice, coerce, manipulate young people to be involved in these particular behaviors. Because essentially, young people are given responsibility beyond their means. So they're told through social media platforms, Snapchat, Instagram, that you can just make some money. It was only the other day that The Guardian and The Independent was talking about how things like TikTok are even now being used to groom and coerce children and young people to be involved in county lines. A young person in the article was talking about being on Snapchat, talking to a complete stranger. And within an hour, that individual was offering that young person to be involved in county lines, just jump on the train, carry this package from here to here, and you're going to make all of this money. And there are going to be some young people, sadly, that decide to engage in that behavior, but that's not what's being showed on social media platforms, because what do we see? The Rolex watches, the nice cars, the nice handbags, the nice shoes, the nice trainers that cost hundreds and hundreds of pounds. Not Air Maxes, it's not Nikes, it's Dior, it's Gucci, it's Goyard, it's Louis Vuitton. So young people, because they're celebrities and they're musicians and everybody that they look up to, sports athletes, whatever it may be, are talking about these things and promoting these things, young people are essentially going to want it. And they're told that in order to acquire these things, just get into the trap house and you'll make it. And that's why there was an incident that I remember working on with a young person, where a young person believed in the illusion that by going into the trap house, they were going to make all of this money. And the harsh reality was, he was only making a couple of £100. And I said to him, how much money did you make in the trap house? And he said, I don't know, probably about 25 to 30 grand. So I said, so 30 grand versus £200. 30 grand versus £200. Do you understand what exploitation is? And he was like, no. And then that made me chuckle, because his social worker and youth worker were using words like county lines. So clearly this young person is already disconnected from the conversation, because we as professionals are still using words that young people don't use themselves. Then I went on to ask him then, how's the money split? And he said, between me and some of the other boys, about 500 individuals, or 5 individuals that are given the 200 to 250 pound mark. So I said, okay, let's square it as 1,500 between the group. 30,000 pounds versus 1,500. Someone's being exploited here. But that's not what's being taught to young people. So because we don't know the numbers, because we don't understand how crack and heroin cells in our local communities, or when a young person is a runner and then put into another environment, we're going to allow these children and young people then to run rings around us because we don't understand. And our reality is, for a lot of those young people that can work, the vast reality is that those young people, if they were to work in Burger King, Subway, McDonald's, Sports Direct, JD Sports, they would actually make more money in those particular places of work as it would risking their lives for weeks to come only home with £250. But we ain't gonna know that if we don't understand the issue as it relates to drugs and the process of that. And also understanding that when these young people go into these environments, not only are they having to deal with money at a macro level, they're also having to deal with adults that possibly are mentally ill, individuals that may have an overdose in front of them. They've also got to worry about other gangs in the area that may be competing for maximum profit. So those young people are given weapons to arm themselves, taking into context that these young people are probably not violent, probably not been in issues before. And how many stories have we seen over the last 3 years where young people have been murdered? They've been murdered in a crack house by other young people. Their lives have been taken by other adults. Young people have been sexually exploited, sexually abused. Data is very short as it relates to county lines and sexual harm and violence. Why? Because as we know that in the context of rape, sexual violence and harm, oftentimes individuals, as it relates to males compared to females, males oftentimes do not report those particular issues, but we can look at data as it relates to the NHS. And when we're talking about young people that have entered into the triage room in A&E through anal tears, and those anal tears oftentimes are not to do with plugging. So the question then is, what else is happening to our young people in these environments? And this is the debate oftentimes we have with young people, is getting them to look past this illusion, because that's exactly what it is. So the biggest argument I present to young people is, let's be realistic. If somebody really wants to make all of this money, why would they want to talk to you as a complete stranger and want you to do some work for them? Why would somebody be so giving if money is so easy to attain? You know, the second thing is, your own rappers talk about real millions are not made in the bando, they're made on the ports and the harbors. Blade Brown, by the way. Nobody knows who Blade Brown is, then I don't know what else to explain. But going back to the point, are we up to the time? And this is not me again, this is what young people are saying. And this is what they're promoting on social media platforms. So when we talk about then violence, when we're talking about the change between young people being enticed to being involved in criminal activity, we also have to have the conversation about, well, what's been done in the context of violence and what is social media doing to trigger these particular issues. Just want you to just look at this image for a moment. Because young people for a very long time are not stupid. Young people know that there is profit, wealth, and gain through the things that they promote and upload onto social media platforms. So we have to also have what I would argue, another critical conversation here, what I call exploitation and consumerism, because we are consuming this stuff. And I say we, I'm talking about us across the country are consuming this stuff. And whilst we are consuming it, we also have to talk about how are children and young people being exploited in these particular processes, because I know BBC One Extra do not hold accountability when a child or young person goes onto their particular station and talks about killing, shooting, stabbing, hurting people in their local community. I know Nike, Puma, Adidas, JD Sports hold no accountability when young people that wear their brands that also are promoted and sometimes sponsored by these individuals that promote violence within their community don't oftentimes get brought up for these particular things. So when we talk about this idea about exploitation, we have to have a wider conversation here. because young people are not stupid, as I just mentioned. So when we talk about things like music, and you know, we at one point, you remember grime was the issue, and now it tends to be drill. Young people are looking at these things and thinking, well, if I can get a deal with Adidas or Sony or Virgin, or if I can make music through these particular labels, can this be a golden ticket for me to get out of the ends? Can this be a golden ticket that's going to get me out of the hood? And in most cases, of course. So do we blame young people for jumping in the booth, talking about shooting, killing, stabbing, misogyny, bitches, hoes, and all of these things you hear them talk about and promote? Do we blame them? Because in a wider capitalist society, all of these brands, including Netflix, Hollywood, BBC, all of these media stations seem to be profiting off all of these things. So do we blame our young people for engaging? The deeper question is, who's consuming it? And guess what? This is the harsh reality when we talk about racism and systemic violence. Those that consume it are not the individuals that are at the forefront and the victims of it. Who are the consumers? So when young people are talking about hurting and harming each other, we have to have the wider conversation about our society here. And in our society, we like violence. In our society, we like to buy violence. We like to consume violence. I like Netflix. I like Narcos. I like Breaking Bad. I like Sons of Anarchy. I like Ozark. I like Snowfall. I like Power. I like programs like this because it's entertainment. And just like the consumers that want these children and young people, our children and young people, to talk about their real life experience, it's just for entertainment. But the harsh reality is that young people then have to live their lives. And then we have to pick up the pieces within our local communities. So when we talk about the idea of the golden ticket, it's a deep conversation. It's a deep conversation. And these things become really important. So when we talk about accountability, we have to also start talking about these big brands that promote and allow and instigate our children and young people to join this. And I remember being on a show with the BBC not long ago, and I was asked, Craig, what do you think the reason for violence, in your local communities? Is it the teachers? Is it the parents? Is it the youth workers like us? I said, no, can we start with the BBC? Because you guys promote this type of stuff sometimes on your channels, and we don't. And I don't know why these people are always asking me for interviews. I'm sometimes the worst person to call, because I'm going to start with the powers that be first before I get to the local community, because there's accountability at all levels. But I think it's important to understand that young people are buying into that. And this is the problem. Because the problem that we're dealing with, the fact that the beef is amplified through social media platforms, through music, through uploading of particular videos. And there's an audience, but there's two audiences here. So there's one audience that we've just previously seen, but there's also another audience that exists within our community. Because if you disrespect me, let's say, I don't know, Sean disrespects me. I got Sean at the top of my screen. Sean disrespects me, and everybody else in the room is commenting, whether it's on Instagram, whether it's on YouTube. Everybody's commenting on what they think I should do, what they think Sean should do to me. And whilst you're all commenting on about how me and Sean are most likely going to play to the audience's requests, but regardless if you're from the local community or whether you're buying it solely from this consumerist perspective of just being a wider audience, you have a very powerful role to play in navigating and perpetuating these particular issues. So whilst I disrespect Sean because I want to get to Wireless, I want to get to V Festival, I want to get to BBC One Extra's next big party, I want to get to the next big event, I'm going to say whatever about Sean in the music booth in order for me to get there. Problem is, however, is that the first audience is saying, yeah, but Sean lives up the road, Craig. So I know that you're trying to get to the big stage, but what happens when you see Sean in Birmingham City Centre? What are you going to do? What are you going to do when you're actually with your mum in the supermarket and you see Sean? What are you going to do? Because the audience now are going to dictate that Sean shouldn't take no disrespect from Craig whatsoever, and vice versa. And are these things are not we're seeing in our local communities, where a video gets uploaded and somebody gets stabbed and shot? Are we not seeing that for every music video that gets uploaded? There's sometimes tit-for-tat shootings that happen in the local community. Most of the individuals that are now perpetrators currently serving life has mentioned that something around social media instigated some particular issue. So when we talk about the amplification of violence in our local community, we can no longer just keep saying that, you know what, it's just about the cuts contribute. But I think it extends the wider conversation, which I was alluding to in the beginning, that we're looking at violence from a default position. And that default position is highly punitive and very much a criminal justice lens. And all that means in the most layman terms is that we're sitting again within a criminal justice model. We wait for something to happen, then we respond. Very much reactive. It's not early intervention. It's not preventative in its true nature. We're just responding. And that's the reason why we feel like we're firefighting nationally. That's the reason why we feel like we're firefighting. Because looking at this issue of violence being a public health issue, I don't need to bore you with all of the data and statistics, but the World Health Organization in 2017 had argued this, following the issues in places like Chicago, following the issues in places like Baltimore, remembering that South Africa and Glasgow, and went to those particular places like your South Africas, your Baltimores and Chicagos and your New Yorks to understand how we can bring a public health approach. Because at that particular time, you remember that Glasgow at one point in time was a knife crime capital of Europe. Oftentimes you don't really hear about that again, the racialization of crime, the politics of race and crime. So we never really heard about that. And unless you're a person that knows about statistics and data, you'll know that what is oftentimes projected in the media is not close to what the statistical data says. But as we know, that the argument has always been that we need a public health approach to respond to this. And the only way we're going to respond to this is being or functioning from a model that is community-led and it's academically driven. So that goes back to my original point in the beginning, that when we're taking the position, what position are we taking? Is it just emotive? And that's why I made the point about sometimes that we enter into loads of different events and we come together as different bodies, and it's very emotive and it sounds great. We're all in the building and we're very passionate and the passion's amazing. But what's the approach and what's the model? Because Glasgow took an approach, they took a position, they said we're going to utilize this theoretical underpinning through public health and we're going to respond. Baltimore, New York, Chicago, South Africa did the exact same thing. That we're going to use this theoretical approach and we're going to function this particular way of doing things throughout the community. What's our approach? Or are we still going based on, well, back in the day, I used to be this, or back in the day, I used to know such and such, and because I've been working in this field for all of these years, this is how I think. All of that sounds great, but it's not a foundation. Aspects, most definitely, but it's not a foundation, because we have to go based on what works. So we have to look internationally to then start to look at nationally and then locally. So locally, it says that in order for us for public health to work, it means then we have to use a community-led approach, which means then we need to start forming new partnerships. Sorry to tell you, we can't go this one alone. So it means then our organizations need to somehow start to connect and build partnerships. We need to somehow find a way. I'm not saying every organization needs to be friends and every organization needs to work together. What I'm suggesting is, in order to shape the status quo and have a radical change in responding to this issue, we have to work together as the community and within the community. We can't no longer sit from the ivory tower And we can't think from the statutory organizations that are out there that we're going to local authority our way out of this, because you can't. It needs the community. It needs grassroots knowledge. It needs people that have the reach. It needs people that are on the ground doing the detachment and outreach work to connect the dots to every single one of us. But again, it has to be academically driven. Because this is where I argue. This is where my research now currently brings me. Because road has now become an ideology. For those that have attended previous sessions would understand this. It's become an ideology now. So in order for us to have a new approach to respond to issues in our local community, it's about also understanding that the changing face of youth culture, the changing face of subcultures in our communities that are now becoming dangerous, that are now becoming even more criminal and antisocial. We're now dealing with a new mindset. And it's a mindset that's now become fixed amongst our children and young people. And how do I know this? When I go to places like Norfolk, on the seaside in Great Yarmouth, young people are talking a particular way. They're all talking about trapping and being in the bando. It's the only way they're going to get out of the end. And then I go to a local community and young people are saying the exact same thing, regardless of what they look like, regardless of where they come from, regardless of their backgrounds. Even affluent children now have this now new fixed mindset. I'm working with a young person and have done so for a number of years. Family of millionaires, but now has adapted this mindset of he now wants to get it on his own. And the only way I'm going to get that is through engaging in criminal activity, and he's got much better over the last couple of years. But the point that I'm making is it's become fixed. So if we was to now just throw money at these issues, we know that there's another £1 million coming in to different cities, Birmingham included. Now it's going to help with youth workers. I'm going to be critical here. Even if you used to open back all of the youth provisions that got closed in 2009 and 2010, it's not going to solve this problem now, because it's become fixed amongst our young people's minds and hearts nationally. So our role then is, if we're going to develop a model that's then going to be community-led and academically driven, it has to engage with this new ideology. So that means then we have to be practical and have to provide young people with ideas and things that are going to be proactive and give them the tools to be able to respond to these particular issues. And that's why most of the work that I do now currently with children and young people in any context is not just about awareness, it's about showing young people. And that's why many of you will be familiar with a new project that's taking place in Birmingham called Black Excellence in Brum. And all that is talking about is we're moving beyond just raising awareness now. We have to connect with individuals and young people to show them how. Because that's what they're asking, how. And I'll give you one example. I was doing some work in a school some time ago. And I remember being in the auditorium and the session was around knife crime and raising awareness of county lines and criminal exploitation and the damage it brings to families and communities and so on and so forth. And at the end of the presentation, all of the teachers was happy. All of the practitioners in the building was really ecstatic. And as the young people were leaving the auditorium, I always shout out, anybody that wants to have a conversation with me, I'm here. And then some young people, 3 young men, walked towards me sheepishly. And what they said, yo, sir, that session was 6 still, but I still have to carry my knife. And that's my point. And what those young men taught me that day was, Craig, yes, you're raising awareness, but what you failed to do was give these young people strategies of how they can keep themselves safe. So if you are rolling out programs, whether you're detached or outreach, you work for statutory organizations, or you're in the community supporting parents, what are you giving them as practical strategies alongside raising awareness of those particular issues? And I'm going to take it a step deeper. How are you doing it? Are you just doing it in the traditional, want people to come into a room and a flip chart piece of paper? How are you using technology to engage them? Are you doing work on road with young people, teaching them in the park, on the street, outside the local bookie, outside the local barbershop? What are you doing in the barbershop, in the bookie, with people in the community? And you're extending the informal education for our community and not just talking about it, but showing individuals how to do it. Because that's how you respond to these particular issues. That's how you ultimately engage. And you have to meet young people where they're at. And that's why I talk about in my research, within my PhD, not only road becoming an ideology, I talk about this idea about phasing out. And this is a harsh pill that sadly is hard to swallow. Why? Because we as collectors have developed what is called a savior complex, because we put ourselves in a default position. We can save them all. We can save the whole world. And I used to be one of those youth workers. Many of you will remember when I used to work at Oaklands, I had that, and a few of my, my elders in the room. I can see some of you hiding that are there, but some of you will remember when you used to say to me, Robin and others, that Craig, you can't save them all. And I was sitting there thinking, now you guys don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about. You old heads don't know what you're talking about, but they were right, because you have to meet people where they're at. And what was happening to me was all of those young people, where we were warehousing those young people and doing as everything that we could possibly do, that we had the resources to be able to do so. And 3 years later, they were starting to get older and they're saying, Craig, I need money. I don't really want to be in the youth center no more. I need to make some money. And I can't get a job. I've got a criminal record. And therefore, the individuals in the community, their vulnerabilities were there and were increased. And they were saying, you man can sell drugs. You man can now hold weapons. And then some of those individuals went on to murder other young people in our community and now currently serving 35 years in prison. And I'm sitting there outside of court after the verdict. I'm thinking, you know what am I doing wrong? Because the default position that many of us take is we are over sympathetic and over empathetic to the children and young people that we're working with. So where there's 100% success in most programs, initiatives, which many people in the room will agree with, is when an individual says that I'm ready to leave. I don't want to be involved in the road no more. And that's when the doors then starts to open. And then we start to think about those different ways that we can try and engage with different individuals in those spaces. And it's only through then when you start to develop your superpower, because your superpower is actually contained within the elements of what you can also bring to the table. And then the question then is, how do we help young people navigate these particular ideals in these particular spaces? And the biggest thing is trauma. We talk about being trauma informed, that's one level. But I also think there's another element here about when we're talking about helping young people navigate, I think it's also about being honest. And in that honesty that I just presented about savior complexes, I think the honesty is also about acknowledging what we can't do. So I know that I am unable to give a child and a young person any form of counseling or any therapeutic intervention. Why? Because I'm not trained and I don't specialize in that area. So that means then we have to start using individuals in our community that do. Some of you are in the room right now. So I know that, one of the organizations that we use is an organization called Belgrave Mind. Some of you may be familiar with the organization. And they do a lot of work in our local community with young people that are impacted by other elements and high levels of trauma, using person-centered approaches within schools and within the wider community, not just for young people, but also for parents. So we have to also be very honest in this conversation as well. So that's where partnerships make perfect sense. And that's how you then start to look at what I call the cycle of deviance. And then you look at the element where I spoke about disorganized communities, and we then start to become better organized. So yes, we can be trauma informed, but what we need to start doing, and it happens all the time, is saying that the wrong strategy or approach is applicable for all young people. Perfect example. I remember a parent contacted me and saying, my son needs some real help. And when I asked the parent what the issues were, sounded to me that child was traumatized. He's like, oh, no, it's okay. He's got a youth worker. It's almost like we as a society downplay mental health. And I can say this as a JNC qualified youth worker. Yes, we are trauma informed, but we're not qualified therapists. So a youth worker is not the person to help a child or young person that's going through trauma, only to support the process, connecting the dots, signposting. So if I develop a relationship with a child or young person and they trust me and they know that I've got them, and let's say Antonio, for example, is the therapist, then I'm going to say that, yo, Antonio, if you trust me, or that young person trusts me, then Antonio, the therapist, is who you need to talk to. That's signposting in its true sense. Not that we just go through a piece of paper and say, you know, reading an organization, and not to knock any organization, just say, I'm using the name Birmingham Mind, for example. And you say, okay, Birmingham Mind, and you just signpost the young person without doing anything. These are the things that we're failing as an organization. These are the things that we're failing and become really important. And I always say this, that a part of our personal toolkits, if we may, when you're engaging with young people, what are you using to engage? And this is why I said in the beginning, I'm a massive advocate of skill audits, because I know most organizations are guilty of this. They think when a young person is going through problems and has an issue, the first point of call is mentoring. Mentors can't solve all problems. Youth workers can't solve all problems. Therapists can't solve all problems. But it's how do we work with each other in a multi-agency framework that engages with different types of children and young people that are going through a wide range of different things, that we can give them the opportunity to have a range of different services. Because there's going to be things that therapists can do that youth workers can't do, vice versa. There's going to be things that educators can do, whether informally or formally, that can do, that are going to be different to what other individuals are able to do. And it is just about, well, what are we doing different to engage? Or are we just doing the one strike rule? We use one intervention, that doesn't work, and then we just say to that child and young person that there's not much else we can do. We don't say it directly to them, but we say it to our bodies. And then criminal justice agencies then pick them up. What are we doing? Utilizing things like drama, role play, the arts, to engage children and young people in their choices and to get them to thinking about creative ways that they can express themselves, but also ways that they can become entrepreneurial. How are we doing that through music? I'm not a fan of drill. I'll be totally honest. I don't like drill music. I'll be the first one to say that. But if drill is needed to use as an intervention with some of my young people to express themselves, providing they're not talking about killing and shooting, let's use drill. What about traveling, enabling children and young people to see environments outside of the current environment that might be traumatic for them? Taking them out of their environment has always been proven to help reduce one's anxiety. Some of us that have done outreach work, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You're talking to a young person and every minute they're looking over their shoulder, every car that goes past. You can't do an intervention with a young person that's doing that. I can't. Last time I was on a block with some young people and every minute I said, lads, I need to get off. I need to get off. Like, I can't engage with you like whilst you're doing that, because if you're nervous, it's making me nervous, and I really value my life, and I'm sure you all do too. But I can't engage in these types of environments. So taking children and young people out of their environment for a moment, don't have to be in a recreational activity, we're just taking them out of their environment to enable them to think. So you can also challenge those beliefs and those values that are fixed, that they don't believe that they are able to do. Because my argument is, if you're entrepreneurial and you use those entrepreneurship skills to flip a quarter, half a key of cocaine or heroin, and you can make all of this money, then you can put it in business. But I can guarantee that when that child or young person says, how? Many of us are looking like, what do you mean, how? Go to Google, go onto the government website. You can open up a business under £50. Then the next stage, the building blocks to enable that child and young person, or predominantly young people we're talking about here, that can find their way and find their lane through different ways and different means. So it means that we have to do a bit of research, but it also means that we have to also go through some healing too. Not as just professionals, as parents and the wider community, because we're also engaging and we're going through what I would call intergenerational trauma. So if we're experiencing high levels of intergenerational trauma and we haven't engaged in our trauma, then the question I would say is, again, are we fit for purpose? When working with children and young people that are impacted. And that's why I always say for youth workers, especially sometimes we have workers that want to volunteer and they come in, and because they've come from a background of being a victim or survivor of sexual harm and violence, they want to work with young people. They want to work with some of the young girls. They want to work with some of the young boys. And I always ask, what have you gone through in terms of help and support? Because you don't know what's going to trigger you. You don't know what's going to open up that can of worms for you. And a broken practitioner can't help broken young people. That's just my philosophy. So clinical supervision then also becomes important as part of your organizations. So if we can invest a lot of money into our programs, we can invest a lot of money also into clinical supervision. And the organization that I just mentioned, Belgrave Mind, if anybody wants the details, also can provide that too. I think there's a couple of other people that are in here that provide those services, Yvette and others that work with ACT and others as well. And I think that becomes really important when we're talking about the wider healing of our community. And I want to kind of end it here really, because I want to open the door just for a few questions. And I just argue that most of this work is around pulling back the onion, rather than focusing on gangs, rather than focusing on youth violence, rather than focus on criminal exploitation, even though all of those things are important. These are the things that I argue that need to be part of our interventions. And if they're not, that's the reason why we're losing. That's the reason why it feels that we're slightly overwhelmed and overburdened with these issues. What are we doing to address the fear, the guilt, the shame, the hurt, the trauma? What does respect mean? Ego, can we let things go? Can you give people a pass? Can we teach our young people to give people a pass? They feel disrespected, can they let it go? Can we develop programs to enable them to let it go? Because many of us have developed the resilience to let it go. Listen, nobody can't draw me out because I've got too much to lose. So how do we get that into our young people? To get them to recognize that life is important. So ego and work around ego becomes really important, even more than the county lines and gangs and criminal exploitation. And moving beyond that is also about helping them to discover their identity, how they can reframe, rebuild, re-identify with who they are and what they are, so they can create that new lease of life to be able to respond to those particular issues. Because one thing that I will say is that we have to keep planting the seeds, even if we see no growth. We have to keep planting those seeds because we just don't know. And the biggest rewards, as many of you will remember, is and know that you may be just walking with your family or you're in the supermarket or whatever, and a young person runs up on you and reminds you and says, "Yo, Craig, you remember me?" I'm sitting here like, I don't know who you are. And they're like, "Yeah, back in the day, you used to work at that youth center." And they start reminding you, and then you're like, "Yeah, man, you was the kid that used to smash the windows." And then they start telling you that, you know what? Yeah, man, you was that guy, man. And what you did for us was enabled us to do that. And I remember not long ago, I was doing some work with Wolverhampton Violent Reduction Unit, or the Violent Reduction Unit in the West Midlands, but it was in Wolverhampton. And you know, a young person of mine that used to attend our old youth centre, he decided to surprise me by putting himself on the screen just before I ended. And it was heartwarming to see. And he said these words, and he said, "Craig, I now work as a youth worker in this area, and I want to make sure that my youth centre is exactly how you made sure our youth centre was." And he was one of the troubled ones. So you just don't know sometimes that when those seeds become fruits. So as hard and as difficult as this work is, I always say for each and every one of us, continue to be that. Continue to be bearers of light. Continue to be individuals in the room that, for some young people, you may be the only version of positivity. And let's connect much better. Let's develop better partnerships, even if it's just a connection and a number that you can utilize to work with. I think that becomes important. So I want to thank each and every one of you for listening. There may be some questions, Cheryl, that come up in the group chat that people may want to utilize, but by all means, open the floor.
Can I just start by saying thank you so much, Craig, for delivering this masterclass. It's a fantastic end to the bank holiday. It was very powerful. It was thought-provoking, and it's really made me think about my practice and the position in terms of where I need to stand and what I need to do. And I hope everybody felt the same. If anybody has any questions, do you want to just mute yourself and just go ahead and ask your question? If there's no questions, it could be just a comment.
There's one question in there.
Okay.
So it says, hi there, how crucial do you think a JNC qualification is for youth workers? Do you believe that the JNC is valued by other professionals? And ultimately, does it benefit our young people to have qualified youth workers? I most definitely think so. I do believe it's undervalued. I think in the world of youth work, it's definitely valued as a JNC qualified youth worker. One of my arguments is this. No, it doesn't go, I know it doesn't go down well sometimes in a lot of circles, but I argue that I think it's imperative that anybody that wants to work with children and young people have to go through some form of youth work training. It can't just be based on this idea of they have a background of experience. So that challenges the notion that only people with lived experience can work with children and young people that are impacted by these issues. And I think that's where the government policy went wrong, and where the current government went wrong, because they thought that just by getting the whatever, gang member, drugs person or whatever, it was those individuals that work with young people. And what happened then was those individuals started to realize, oh, other than the story, what now? Lacked emotional intelligence, lacked interpersonal communication skills, understanding how to bring a child and young person from A to B, not understanding what it means to be trauma-informed, and understanding the principles of informal education, and understanding what it means to work in community and partnership work and multi-agency working. And then what's then left is you just got individuals that are classified as mentors, and it's just them. So my argument in conclusion is have both. Individuals with lived experience, but also having individuals that essentially youth work trained to be able to respond to different children and young people.
There's another question. How do we start working in partnerships successfully?
I see it happening every single day. We've got LinkedIn, we've got Instagram, we've got so many ways that people can connect with each other. I gave you an example before, you know, ACT and our organization have always worked in partnership with each other.
Yeah, we have.
From when I was at the university, we've always worked, you know, some of the individuals in the room, I've always made a way in some way that we can connect some way, shape or form. You know, I see Sean, I see Natalie, I see Raf, I see Megan, I see
Sarah Rose.
Sarah, I see Susan, you know, I see Robin. There's so many people in the room.
Leah,
that, you know, the
everybody.
partnerships, there's people, even if I've missed you, sorry, but the partnerships are essentially there. You know, I think that in a technological space, I think it's damn near impossible now to not be able to connect with people and develop new relationships.
Okay. There was something around supervision in terms of like the role of kind of supervision, and is it challenging? And do you receive coaching or something like that? Just to kind of summarize.
I think I mean, I personally, you know, therapy is important. Clinical supervision to our teams are also important. That's why I mentioned the organization, Belgrave Mind, because they're an organization that I think that is important in being able to do that. I think I've got their information here. If you head over to this website, they're an organization that work currently in a lot of our pupil referral units, where in Birmingham we call it the COBs. In alternative provisions. And then this is an organization that, again, person-centered workers. I think for me, the biggest thing about young people in therapy, in particular, before we talk about staff, is having practitioners that know the young people, that are reflective of the young people. And young people don't see therapy as this thing of, you know, white, middle class, someone in an office that's way above their age, that has no connection and understanding of their reality. And I think just as important as it is for workers, I think it's also important for us as practitioners to be able to connect with that also as well. So yeah.
That's great. Just quickly then, before we finish, Craig, I don't know if you want to quickly just talk about the Solve Academy in terms of if people want more CPD kind of training or experience.
So we do have an online platform where we have CPD for individuals that want to kind of learn a little bit more in depth of some of the subjects that I spoke about today. I do talk about them a little bit more in depth for our training. Some of them are accredited at level 3, similar to the program that Shez is going to talk about shortly. So yeah, if you just hit us up on the website, and we'll be able to push you through all those channels for you and your organization to kind of get that. Then the last question, just quickly before we exit out, there's a backlash against cultural competency, how to respond. I personally don't use those fancy words. I just get people to just develop an anti-racist approach. And I think in an anti-racist approach, you should be working in a way in which is inclusive of all, but more specifically in looking at wherever there's deficits and disparities, that we seek to work in a particular way that enables us to be fit for purpose.
And just finally from me, in terms, again, thank you so much again, Craig. And also, if anybody's interested in the OCN Level 3 Working with Gangs and Youth Violence course, we do have a course that is starting on the 28th of April again. It's the similar discussions, more of what's been discussed today, but in more depth. It is a certificate course. You get 28 credits and it's through OCN. So if you want to just contact us, send us an email or go to one of our social platforms and contact us. Also, we're just going to be asking if everybody can complete the evaluation form for tonight. That will enable you to receive a certificate for your attendance. So that's been put into the chat, and it will also be emailed out to all the participants, along with all our handles in regards to our social media and information about the OCN Level 3 Working with Gangs and Youth Violence course. So yeah, that's it. Thanks again, Craig. It was amazing, very powerful, very thought-provoking. Take care, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much.
Catch you soon, Shez. Take care.
Thanks a lot, Nat. Take care. Great to see you.
Lovely to see you, hon. Thanks, Craig.
Yeah.
Oh, just a quick question. If I wanted to get in touch with Craig, use one of the his LinkedIn or his website pages and stuff.
Yeah, I think he had his details up earlier. We'll try and drop something in the chat. So if you just hang around, we'll put something in.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot for attending.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Can we drop, admin, can we drop Solve's email address in the chat, please, for somebody that's just requested it? Have you got it, or I can quickly just jump on and get it?
I've just put the 2 different Instagrams in the chat, but if you've got the email.
Yeah, I've got the email. Okay, I'll just jump back on and just drop it in.
But we will send out the PowerPoint tomorrow anyway, so the details should be in that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Okie dokie.